Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be hopefully an interesting one. I'm going to be looking at the math behind excess deaths and COVID-19 and possible explanations for the numbers. I want people to understand what is really going on with COVID, and I want people to understand what they're not telling you. So if we look, I kind of want to break down the first narrative, which is the current situation. So if we look at this is the world meters. It basically gives real-time statistics about the virus in terms of the number of cases, the number of deaths, all that kind of stuff. If you look at the US total, it shows that there was almost 10 million cases. And of those 10 million cases, 237,000 people died. And there was a pretty, US has been really active about testing. So if you look at the number of tests, they've almost tested everybody in America. Like half of the population has been tested. That there's probably people that have been tested multiple times, but the point is they've done a lot of testing. U.S. has done the far most testing of any nation in the world. And that's important to understand because it really does give you a sense of how the virus plays out. Because if you know exactly how many people are infected and how many people die, then you can kind of get a very accurate number of the death rate for the disease. So that's this is kind of useful stats. It shows how each of the states fared within this. It's ranked right now based on the cases. I could rank it based on the deaths per population. So if you notice, if you go by deaths per million, New York and New Jersey, and they did by far the worst. And Massachusetts did really bad. If you look at the history of those places, one of the things that they did was they were putting people that were infected with COVID into nursing homes. So basically they're exposing the most vulnerable people to the virus. And when you do that, you get a lot of deaths. So Cuomo really does is very responsible for many of the deaths that happened in New York. The number of deaths you can see is huge, far greater than any other state. I actually show you that. It's almost, New York has almost double the number of deaths to any other state. Almost, not quite, but quite, almost close. So yeah, just a terrible job that was done in New York. And this was just bad policy, bad government policy. So with that said, I want to get you now to understand what the numbers really mean. Another thing that we should understand about the current situation, I'm going to scroll down here a bit, is we look at the total cases. Now, what's going to happen is this is a number that's going to constantly grow because as more people get sick, the number will constantly grow. It'll never go down. It's not a thing that goes down. It's just a cumulative of how many people got infected. So this is the total cases. It's just going to keep on going up. So nothing to fear. It's just going to gradually go up. What you really want to see within this total case number is it to slowly sort of flatten out a bit. You don't want to see this kind of curve where it kind of goes really, really high, really, really fast. If you looked at the curve here in the early stages, it looked like almost like an exponential curve where it was growing very, very fast, and it looked like everybody in the U.S. would have COVID and die from it. So it was pretty scary. But as you progress, it looks more of a linear curve, which means that it's sort of growing at a steady rate rather than a really, really fast rate where you're seeing for every one case there might be 2 people get infected, and that would be exponential growth. It's much more of a linear growth, if that makes sense. So the next thing we look at is the daily cases in the United States. So if you look right here, this is what's going on right now. So this is October 30th. We had 100,000 new cases in the United States. So this was the highest ever one-day total of new cases within the United States. So this is crazy. This is like a big number. So you think, wow, things are really messed up. Think United States, everyone's going to die. Well, not so fast. This number doesn't actually equate to a huge number of deaths. So there's a couple things that have happened since the virus has come out. Early on, a lot of people were dying from COVID. And that was based on bad policies. As I said, in New York, they did stupid things where they were putting sick people into nursing homes. Don't do that. Not recommended. But also, there's another thing that's happened. The medical system has gotten better at treating people with COVID. So even though there's an increase in the number of cases, there's also treatment provided for most of the people that are, getting sick. So you're more likely to survive. Also, there's like a whole bunch of alsos here. Another thing that you have to understand is that viruses over time become less virulent. If you're a virus, you don't want to kill off your host. It's a bad idea, because if you kill off your host, well, you're dead too, as a virus. So what you want to do is not kill your host and spread it to more people so that you can, spread. That's the goal of most viruses, that they want to be sort of part of the system, that they don't really want to kill their host, but they want to spread to as many people as possible. And COVID is no different than that. It's mutated and it's become less virulent over time. So this number is really important to see. Another thing that we have to, one more of these alsos that I had to mention, was that testing has really ramped up since June, since July even. So, as you test more, you will find more cases. And you'll get more asymptomatic cases where people test positive, yet don't necessarily have anything to worry about because they're not necessarily sick. So you'll see just a huge spike just based on testing alone. And another thing that you have to understand is they're using a PCR test. A PCR test will generally get more people testing positive because it uses amplification, which means that people will test positive even if they have very little virus within their system. Maybe even not even enough virus within their system to be infectious or even to be symptomatic. So the PCR test is kind of meant not as a diagnostic, but it's just a way of discovering viruses. It's really not meant for what they're using it for. So you're going to test positive a lot more often with a PCR test. So that's another reason why more testing equals more cases. So with that said, let's look at the deaths. Now the total deaths obviously is going to continue going up. It's another, it looked like exponential at the beginning. It went up very, very fast. Now it became sort of linear over time. So it's just sort of a steady state of deaths. And that number is always going to increase because it's just an accumulation of the deaths. The next thing to look at is the daily deaths. Now this is, if you look early on, you see this huge spike. It just goes up really, really quickly. And this corresponds to what happened in New York, what happened in New Jersey. You had a huge number of deaths, like almost 3,000 per day, which was an insane amount. And it's due to bad policies where you just basically, if you infect the very weak, you'll generally kill off those very weak people. Most of the people that died from COVID were 80 plus. And not only were they 80 plus, but they had 2 to 3 comorbidities, which means that they were dying of something else as well. So yeah, if you infect those people, they will die. Now you'll see that the number is around 920 per day. So it's about a third of the number of deaths that we saw during the peak in April. And we got to remember, though, that the number of cases has actually doubled. So the deaths are down by a third, but the number of cases has gone up by 2 times. So this means that the virus now is about 6 times less deadly than it was at the beginning. Okay? So that's actually something very positive. When Trump mentioned that, the US is turning a corner, well, it really is turning a corner because the number of deaths is quite low compared to the beginning of the whole pandemic. So these are all very important things. But there's more to the story. So a lot of the US numbers are kind of a little bit bogus if I'm trying to be nice about it. Because what happens is a lot of the time the CDC even mentioned that 94% of the deaths were not 100% contributable to COVID. Only 6% of the deaths were contributable to COVID alone. That these were healthy people that got COVID and died. 6%. The other 94% were people who had 2 to 3 comorbidities or were of extreme age. So these are people that were very weak and were dying, were going to die. But one of the things that really scares people is just the number. 200,000 sounds like a huge number of people dying. And you got to understand what that number really means. Every year in the US, about 3 million people die. And that's from random things. That's from car accidents, that's from cancer, that's from pretty much all the different things that you can die of. Well, that equals about 3 million people a year. Okay, so a fair number of people die every year in the US. And if you think about it, this year you've had what's called an increase of deaths due to COVID. There is an increase. It's around just under 10%, about 8% increase of deaths. Okay, so 8% increase in deaths due to COVID. And that's not necessarily certain. I'm going to get into that number even more so, and I'm going to show you that it's actually more like 5%. So not a really huge spike in deaths, even though the number of 200,000 sounds huge. When you compare it to the normal deaths within the United States, it's not that scary. So let's look at something that's more interesting, which is the excess deaths numbers. I'm going to go to another screen here. And these are, I'm going to show you a nice little chart that I found. And this is the excess death numbers, okay? So this shows the number of weekly deaths from all causes, and you'll see back in 2018, 2018, there was a little bit of a spike. This corresponded to there was a flu outbreak that year, and there was a few people that died. So what happened was the number of people that died. Okay, so let me explain quickly what this chart all means. This is the number of weekly deaths, and this is the date at the bottom. This line, this gold line, represents the number of deaths that they expect. So based on averages over many years, how many people do they expect to die each week? Okay, there's sort of a weekly guess at how many people they expect will die. And you'll notice that in the past there was a bit of a spike because there was that flu outbreak, and it corresponded to about 2,000 extra deaths that week, and another 2,000 extra that week, and another, what's this one? I'm trying to get this middle one. Okay, and another 3,000, almost 3,000 deaths that week. So there was, a few thousand extra deaths, like about 10,000 extra deaths. Now, if you look at this here, you'll see that there's a huge spike. This is corresponding to when in New York and New Jersey, they had the huge number of deaths. If you remember the numbers, it was around 3,000 per day. So if you think about it, uh, that's a huge spike in the number of deaths, and that corresponds to these numbers, where you see an extra almost 20,000 people dying per week. Well, 3 times 7 is 20, 21 actually. So that kind of corresponds. So you can actually sort of say, hey, New York, you gave us all these extra deaths. New Jersey as well. So these extra deaths happened during that time period where they did stupid policies and they basically got people killed more than what normally would happen. However, there was mistakes made in other places as well, and COVID is deadly. I'm not saying that COVID's a great thing to have. It is causing more people to die, but the numbers aren't actually that bad. Not something that we should lock down the whole entire world for, and it's more something that we should understand and realize that it is going to increase our deaths, but not to an extent where we're all going to die. Okay, we're not all going to die. And if you look here, this shows that actually the excess death numbers are actually below what the predicted numbers are. So they're predicting like more people to die, but actually less people did die towards the end here. So it's going back to normal almost. Even though, as I said before, we have twice as many cases as during the peak of the deaths in the US. So we almost have to consider, hey, maybe things are not that bad. Actually, let me just show you something back to the death numbers. So remember, the highest deaths were in April, okay? Let's go back up here. And if we look in April, the number of cases was around 32,000 per day. And as I said, it's around 100 to 90 to 100,000 now. So it's almost 3 times the number of cases now. And yet the death rate, the excess death rate is lower. So even though the cases are way, way, way up, the excess death numbers are showing that people aren't necessarily dying. They're not dying more than what we'd normally expect in a year. Another thing that I noticed was this line, this gold line, has been skewed. And I don't know if this is deliberate or some kind of conspiracy or anything like that, but normally the excess death rate should statistically grow at 0.01 or 1% per year. So last year's death numbers, excess death rate, or the number of people that you expect to die, should be about 1% less than this year because there's just more people, and you expect, as more people are in the country, well, you're going to have more people die. It's just statistically that's the way it is. So around 1% growth per year in death. It's a weird number, but that's what happens. So the point is, for some reason, they used a number which is lower. So they actually had this gold line. If you look, compare it to this gold line, where they actually assumed that the excess death numbers would be lower than normal. It doesn't make sense. I'm not sure why they did that, because if you look here, the excess death, this is back in 2017, and it grows at 1% per year, roughly. So 3 years, we expect it to grow 3 to 4%. They expect that the average deaths would be around 57,000. Well, over here, they're guessing the average deaths to be 51,000, which is insane. Why would it be lower than 3 years ago? So this number is kind of skewed. So the excess death numbers are actually better than what this chart is showing. I don't know why they skewed it down, but they did. So just something I noticed. So what I predict, based on the numbers, the COVID caused about, if you do all the math, I kind of calculated it all out. Um, COVID did about 5% extra deaths this year, which sucks. I don't say it's a great thing, um, but it's almost within the statistical error. Usually you have a boundary rate of around 3 to 4%, where you can say, oh, what would we normally predict? Well, it's somewhere, plus or minus 3 or 4%. So if you think about it, if it's only 5%, it's just almost within that statistical boundary of error. How many people actually died from COVID? So, yeah, these are some of the things that I found just looking at the numbers. I can give links to all these things so you can kind of look at it yourself. There's a couple other things that this chart showed. Was one of the things was they equated that the excess death numbers, 67% they attributed to COVID, but they said that 33% were due to other causes like dementia, and there was a bunch of other ones, some heart diseases. And so they actually predicted that there was going to be more people dying anyways this year. So when I was saying that it was around 8% higher, well, if you're taking that 67% number, it becomes around 5% higher death rate due to COVID. So that's kind of where I got the math on that. I hope this video is not too boring because it is very statistical, but I want to give you guys a sense of the math behind COVID and maybe kind of reduce your fear about it, because all this stuff that we're doing right now, the lockdowns, the mask wearing, it's all for nothing. It doesn't actually change anything. They could say, well, maybe because we wore masks, or maybe because of the lockdowns, we reduce the potential for the virus to kill millions and millions of people. Maybe. I don't necessarily see that being the case. Because even when you had governments doing really, really stupid things, I mean, really stupid things, where they're basically putting sick people into nursing homes, which is a dumb thing to do. But even after all of that, you still only have a 5% increase in the number of deaths that you would normally expect. So is that something to really worry about? So even if you do the dumbest thing possible, you only get a 5% increase in deaths. So had the governments just not been involved, because it was stupid government policy that actually led to that excess death, rather than lockdowns or anything like that, or lack of lockdowns, I should say. Basically, you would have had a normal year had the government not been involved at all. Just had they just let people do their own thing, probably would have been a normal year in terms of deaths. But because they actually implemented policy that encouraged death, they got the results that they were looking for. They got more deaths. So I really want people to understand this, that, all this calling for like the government to get involved isn't necessarily going to help us. We really should do basic things. Part of the reason why the excess death numbers are actually low right now, where we're in a situation where we're not having as many people get sick or whatever, is because people are doing more precautionary things. Like they're washing their hands, they're covering their face when sneezing or coughing. They're doing things that they normally might not be so diligent about doing. How often do you normally wash your hands? Like last year, I'd wash my hands, when I go to the bathroom and stuff like that, but I wouldn't wash my hands after just leaving the house. But now I do. So just doing those kind of things, you do reduce your chances of getting sick. And that might result in fewer people dying. So if anything that we can learn from this, the one positive thing is maybe we're more hygienic and we'll be better at reducing future deaths because we will be more hygienic. But all this other stuff, the mask wearing, the quarantines, really, really useless, not serving any purpose at all. Might make people feel safe, but the detrimental impacts of it could be dramatic. The financial, the mental effects of it. So this has been Socially Triggered. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.